It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Henry Skerritt, Curator of Indigenous Arts of Australia at the Kluge-Ruhe Collection. Henry joined Kluge-Ruhe through the Mellon Indigenous Arts Initiative in 2016. He has a PhD in art history from the University of Pittsburgh and an MA in art curation from the University of Melbourne. Among his many curatorial achievements at Kluge-Ruhe and beyond, I'd like to mention particularly the Inside World Contemporary Aboriginal Australian Memorial Poles on view at the Fralin Museum at UVA. Unfortunately, as a result of COVID-19, the Fralin is now closed. However, Henry has conducted a wonderful virtual tour of the exhibition, and we will share the link through the chat feature. The title of his lecture is Sex, Sorcery, and Spirits in Arnhem Land. Please welcome Henry Skerritt with a virtual round of applause.
Well, thank you, Margot, and it's certainly lovely to see everyone as black squares. I've been doing this for a few weeks now, lecturing to my students, so I'm getting quite used to sitting in my office and talking to myself. I just would like to quickly take a moment, as this is going out to the whole world, to just warn Indigenous viewers to respectfully advise them that the following presentation contains the names and images of people who have passed away. So today, what I'd like to do is to zoom in on a very special place. Oh, look at that. That's Australia. We're taking big picture, but we're going to go in a bit further to this place called Arnhem Land. And we're going to do a very, very quick fire tour across this region. It's about 37,000 square miles, and it's home to around 12,000 Indigenous Australians speaking over 20 different languages. And I want to zoom in on this place because from the stone country in the west to the sparkling beaches in the east, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It's also a place with an extraordinarily vibrant living culture, one that draws upon extremely ancient practices, as well as a more recent history of engagement with visitors, first from Makassar in modern Indonesia, and later from Europeans. But it's also a place that has played an oversized role in the history of art of Australia and of the world. Many of the first Indigenous Australian artworks to be exhibited in Australia, the US, and Europe were from Arnhem Land, and the region continues to produce cutting-edge artists whose works compete on an international level. And here we've just got a few examples of those from the Art of Australia, which toured the USA in 1941, featuring some beautiful barks from Arnhem Land, this fabulous exhibition curated by Alan McCulloch in the 1960s. But, you know, I could not have, Charlottesville down there as well. So, you know, we've got Jambo Marawili at the Istanbul Biennale, rubbing shoulders with Gabriel Maralingura and Joe Goimala at the Fralin Museum of Art. Now, this lecture has been inspired by a course that I teach at UVA, which does this tour over the duration of a whole semester. And so today, what I'm giving you is a very abridged version. But what I'm sort of hoping is if this goes well, and you can put up with me a few more times, we might be able to extend it into a longer series. But tonight, we're just going to dip our toes into the art of Arnhem Land. Although, as a metaphor, I would be wary of that for two reasons. And one of them is that most of the waters in Northern Australia are full of crocodiles. But I'd also warn you against it because the art of Arnhem Land is highly addictive. And once you've gotten the bug, it's hard to stop. So I'm really hoping that this will inspire you to learn more. And for those of you who are in Charlottesville, you're very well positioned because we have such an extraordinary collection here. So the journey that we're going to take starts at a place called Minjaling, right at the top here. And we're going to travel down to Gumbalanya and then over to Ramingining, Milingimbi, Ramingining, Groot Island and Yirrakala. So I've color coded each of those just to make the lecture kind of easy to follow. When you see orange, you'll know it's from the west. When you see red, it's from the center. When you see green, it's from the northeast. And when you see purple, it'll be from the south. But that's leaving out all these other places. There's all these other places that have also done incredible work and continue to be part of this story. But there's only so much that we can cram into 40 minutes, particularly when this is a story that is really over 40,000 years long. So gosh, it might be a very long series if we stretch it to that kind of length. But the story that I want to talk about today is really a story of continuing engagement, the continuing engagement of the Indigenous people of Arnhem Land with outsiders. But in order to do that, we do have to start at the start. And it's very hard to precisely date what that start is if we are looking at the rock art of Arnhem Land for several reasons. One being rocks are quite hard to date. And the other is that the styles are so palimpsestic. The rock art in Western Arnhem Land is so layered, and you know, the best word is palimpsestic, because that means it's sort of written on top of itself, that it's very difficult to precisely pinpoint the stylistic shifts that are occurring. But the great rock art scholar George Kaluka divides it into a chronological sequence of 4 main periods. The pre-estuarine, which he dates at 50,000 to 8,000 before present. The estuarine, which he dates at 8,000 to 1,500 before present. The freshwater, which he dates at 1,500 to 300 before present. And the contact period of the last 300 years. That's quite complicated, and I think I prefer the more straightforward chronology that was suggested to me by the great artist gallery Noanyilk, who said there was really only 2 categories of rock art. There was binning painting rock art way and mimi painting rock art way. And so what he meant by that was that there was rock art that had been done by people, and then there was rock art that was so old that it could only have been done by the spirits. But there are numbers that are thrown around between 20 and 60,000 years. They're the sort of numbers that people like. But the key thing to note is the rock art of Western Arnhem Land is very, 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 very old. And we see evidence of geological movements. We see inland sites painted. We see coastal site things painted on inland sites. We see evidence of animals that have been extinct for 20,000 years. And we see this art history written on stone that shows tens of thousands of years of continuing occupancy. So these images here that we're looking at are from Inyalak Hill, which is just outside of Gumbalanya. And it's one of the most concentrated and spectacular rock art galleries in the world. And I started here because the story of Indigenous contemporary art begins very, very near. So despite its natural beauty, Arnhem Land proved to be a notoriously difficult place for the British invaders. European visitors had been coming from around the 17th century. In fact, the region Arnhem Land, that peculiar name, comes from the ship that was captained by Willem Houston van Koolsteerd, who sailed into the Gulf of Carpentaria in 1623. But it took until 1827 for the first British outpost to be established at Port Wellington, which is just sort of opposite, it's sort of over here, sort of just above where it says Garigunak Balu National Park. And that was a disaster that lasted 2 years, and disease and bad relations with the Indigenous owners meant that that fort was abandoned after 2 years, and it would take another decade before the British tried again, establishing Port Essington in 1838. So it wasn't really a very auspicious start, and Port Essington only lasted 10 years itself. But in 1869, the British tried again, damn those persistent colonists, and they formed Palmerston, which is now called Darwin. And that was really what allowed this great push into Arnhem Land. But I mention this for a number of reasons, and one is to point out how inhospitable this area was to the British. The landscape that had sustained Indigenous people for millennia was now, in many ways, protecting them from the colonial onslaught that was taking place down south. But also because Port Essington is often associated with the start of collecting of Arnhem Land. And of course, like everything we know, this is part of a much bigger story. So here we have on the right what is widely believed to be the oldest known painting on bark from Port Essington. And it's believed that it was collected by this fella here, Paul Falsh, who in 1869 was tapped to be the first sort of head of the police force in Palmerston. And he'd been working his way through the ranks in the police force in South Australia. And so this was really considered a promotion. And Falsh was a complex figure. He did an awful lot to record Aboriginal people, but he was also ruthless in the masterminding of massacres, of the massacre of Indigenous Australians. I suspect he was also a little bit opportunistic because he tapped into a growing international interest in what at the time would have been called primitive art, and began supplying materials to a number of collectors, amongst which were a number of paintings on bark, like this extraordinary one here in the British Museum. Now, of these barks, only about just under 30 of them are extant. A number of them were destroyed. But they're often called the Port Essington barks, or in the case of these works in Sydney, they're called the Essington Island barks, which is interesting because there's no Essington Island. But what it really suggests is that these works were most likely collected around the peninsula or on the island, Croker Island, which is more correctly known as Mingeling. Now, many of the discussions that take place around these barks suggest that they were collected from dismantling bark huts, that people had painted on bark huts and that they had been dismantled. And that's possible. There are certainly a wealth of evidence of 19th century photos that show these kinds of huts, and they're not dissimilar. But at the same time, there's also a high possibility that these were collected, that these barks were made specifically to be traded, and that's something that we can really only speculate on. What we can see is certainly a similarity to the rock art tradition. They remain relatively raw, without substantial elaboration, but they are beautiful nonetheless. And we do see, particularly I think in this one, there's a beautiful care and detail in the layering of the ochres. I think the way in which many of these paintings occupy the flat space of the bark is really just so fluid and beautiful and priceless, which is an interesting word to use, because I think that these barks are playing a very crucial role in the establishment of this idea of art for trade and for sale. The existence of these barks was published in the Linnean Society in 1878. So, sorry, that's right, I meant to say these have had a important role in the establishment of a market, and Croker Island or Mingeling would become a very, very significant place in the early development of the sort of widespread dissemination of barks in the art world. And here we've got three really quite stunning works, two from our collection, one from the National Museum. And you can see in these works, although they're more elaborated, they're more decorated, there is definitely strong affinities to those early works collected by Paul Falsh. Now, The existence of these barks being published in 1878 I would undoubtedly have been known to this fella, Baldwin Spencer. In 1912, Spencer, who at that stage was the director of the what was called the National Museum in Melbourne, which became the Melbourne Museum and Museum Victoria, travelled to a place that at the time was called Oampelly, which was an incorrect name, a poor translation of the name of a local lagoon. And he travelled there at the invitation of this fellow on the left, Paddy Cale, who was a buffalo hunter who had set up a sort of a frontier station at Goombalanya. And on July 11, 1912, Spencer records in his notes that he records, when I do this part, for my students, I always put on a terrible toffee British accent, but Baldwin Spencer records in his notes that this morning a native brought a little bark drawing. Now, he had been up up around Goombalanya for over 3 weeks, and he had noted in his field notes the custom of decorating bark sheets as temporary shelters. And he had noted that there was paintings on rocks. So he was clearly aware of the artistic traditions that were going on in the region. And so after having dismantled a few of these bark huts, he selected what he deemed to be the superior artists and commissioned them to produce a series of bark paintings for the National Museum of Victoria. Over the next 9 years, with the assistance of Cale, 170 paintings were shipped from Goombalanya to Melbourne. Now, the thing that strikes me with this is that Spencer would have known about those Port Essington barks, and I suspect that the artists who painted for Spencer also knew about them. But that's not to say that this moment doesn't mark a significant turning point. For this moment of Spencer commissioning works and commissioning them through Cale represents his first programmatic commission of Aboriginal Australian art, and it really firmly establishes a market for Aboriginal painting, and most importantly sets the pattern for cross-cultural exchange that would be emulated multiple times over the next century and a half. So the question I have here is, why are these artists so keen to paint? Now, trade is certainly playing a part in this, but I think that the reasons are more political. And I think that in these works, these artists are really trying to assert who they were to the outsiders. And I think one of the signals of this is how these works develop over a short period of time. If we look at the early works collected by Spencer, they're largely secular in subject, often food animals. But as the works develop, artists begin to put more and more of themselves on the line, gradually revealing more ceremonial content and elements that are held close to their chest. At the same time, they're also painting things that reflect their recent experiences. And this is a good case in point, painting of a water buffalo, which was an introduced species that was sweeping through Arnhem Land at the time. Now, the other thing that was sweeping through Arnhem Land at the time was missions. And I think this impetus to express who they were only grew as missions opened in Roper River in 1908, at Goulburn Island in 1916, Groot Island in 1921, Milingimbi in 1923, Goombalanya in 1925, and then finally at Yirrkala in 1935. So, I mean, that's an amazing, I deliberately do that as a list because it's an amazing list to think that in this very short 20-year period, missions have swept across the entire top of Australia. And many of the missionaries were indeed very keen to support Indigenous art. It was a good money spinner. and it was often seen as a way of encouraging self-sufficiency and independence. The first European settlement at Groote Eylandt was established in 1921 by the Church Missionary Society. And when the Reverend Hubert Ernest de May Warren, or H.E. Warren, started travelling to Milingimbi, to Groote from 1916, he was joined by the anthropologist Norman Tyndale, and this set up another kind of pattern of involvement between anthropologists and missionaries. In fact, at this time, Tyndale was officially an entomologist at the South Australian Museum, but he had a very big interest in anthropology as well. Now, the interesting thing about Groote Eylandt was that one of the reasons why it was chosen for a mission because of its remoteness, because it was seen, they were looking, the Church Missionary Society was looking for a place to send children of mixed races, but it was a place that had had a very long history of engagement with the people from Makassar, the Macassans. And the Macassans would travel, they would travel down this way to harvest trepang, which looks like this. Trepang, or the sea cucumber, it's one of the very few things that is not eaten by Indigenous people in Northern Australia, possibly because it looks so delectable. But since the mid-16th century, Macassans had been coming to collect and harvest trepang. And in early works from Groote Eylandt, it's quite common to see Macassan scenes like this one, which is a really wonderful illustration of the processing of processing of trepang that would go on. Now, the barks collected by Tyndale were fairly simple, a lot like the rock art. They were not elaborately detailed. And Tyndale also noted the practice of painting on the inside of bark huts, as well as the rock. He also made a really interesting observation of the use of bark paintings, that he made a note of a large bark painting of a wallaby that was set up as a target for men to use for as a spear target for spear practice. But one of the other interesting things about these early works is that these painters were not living on the mission. These are painters, as I said, the mission had been established for mixed race children. They were coming in to trade. These were people who were still living traditionally on Groote Eylandt, but were coming in. And in doing so, I think they were establishing the rules of engagement around art. Certainly the missionaries were keen to promote secular subject matter and didn't want to encourage them, to be producing heathen idolatrous works. And a lot of the early works from Groote Eylandt do tend to be these images of animals and hunting scenes. 1935, it's visited by the Donald Thompson, and we really do see the start of this very dramatic style of black background works that many people who look at Groote Eylandt work would come to associate with the region. Now, the other interesting thing that's occurring around this time is that alongside the mission, we begin to see industry moving into the area. In 1938, a settlement is formed on Groote Eylandt at Umbakumba, in part to service moves into the region by Shell and Qantas. And this fella here, who's going to weave in and out of the story, Fred Gray moves there to set up the community. So Gray would begin to amass very significant works, and this would be one of the first times that collectors would begin to record the names of artists. And Gray's collecting shows that there was both young and old men painting, and his works began to disseminate to collectors like Leonard Adams, Charles Mountford, Carol Kupka, who all managed to acquire works through Gray. Now, in 1958, that settlement was taken over by the federal government, which meant that the mission became the sole supplier of barks from Groote Island, which was very profitable for them and led to a great increase in production. At the same time, BHP started mining magnesium oxide on the island. And so we see this great increase of bark painting with these black backgrounds, undoubtedly at the encouragement of the missions, but we also see these negotiations beginning to occur between the mining industry and local communities. So we're seeing this incredible shift in power dynamics as you've got missions and government and business all sort of coalescing in the region that had been inhabited for such a long time by its traditional owners. Here we've just got a few magnificent examples of these, and a couple, I thought I should put in a couple from our collection as well. So here's a very beautiful one. And, you know, one of the things that I sort of would stress about the Groote Island work is that this kind of classical work with the black backgrounds is what people always think about. But there is a great diversity as well. And you know, it's an area that of great, you know, exceptional beauty, and one of those areas of Aboriginal art that really played a really important role in the 1930s, 40s, 50s and 60s, but has subsequently been a bit overlooked. So it was really, though, the establishment of a mission at Milingimbi that proved to be an extraordinarily pivotal moment for the formation of what would really become the contemporary Aboriginal art movement. Milingimbi is an island. It's one of the largest islands of the Crocodile Islands group, and it was chosen by the Methodists as a mission because, much like Groote, it had a reputation as a meeting ground for Indigenous people, as well as this long tradition with the Macassans, and it's a place that is covered in tamarind trees as a result of this long connection. So the mission at Milingimbi is founded by this fellow James Watson, who's shown in the picture on the top right. And Watson is very quickly joined by Thomas Theodore Webb and his wife Evelyn Mary, who replaces him in 28, and the lay missionaries Harold and Ella Shepherdson. And this team of Webb and Shepherdson really do start an incredible move to encourage art in the areas around Milingimbi. Shepherdson was in fact somebody who very much had a desire to support the idea of small settlements of people living on their own country away from larger mission settlements. So he flew his own plane out to collect works, to collect artifacts, and to deliver rations to people all around the region. So while Webb and Shepherdson were collecting, they were also encouraging visiting anthropologists. Lloyd Warner arrives in 27 to conduct research and acquires the oldest known hollow log coffin with lock on. After Warner, it's also visited by Donald Thompson in 1935. And he goes back again in 36 and 37. And Thompson's period there marks this incredible moment where there's this flourishing of art. He collects over 5,000 objects, 2,500 photographs across Arnhem Land. But the story that Thompson's story is a much bigger one, and it's one that takes us a little bit further east before we can come back. And it shows how tightly all of these stories get tied together, because in 1931, a number of Japanese fishermen were killed at Caledon Bay in eastern Arnhem Land. Subsequently, a policeman named Constable Albert McCall was sent to the region to investigate, but he was speared on Wooder Island, and the events would prove to be a turning point in art history, really, in Yolngu history, art history, Australian history, global history. It's a strange story, and it's a story that is told in great detail in a number of places. One of which is a very excellent film called Dakia versus the King. But it would appear that McCall, in trying to investigate this, killing of the Japanese fishermen, he had the bright idea that he could perhaps get some information from one of the local Indigenous women, and so he sort of abducted her, which was not viewed particularly well by the husband of the woman, who Dakia, who speared her. Now, Fred Gray, who was over at Groot Island, travels across the coast, and he heads over to try and see what's been going on. And he manages to investigate who speared McCall, and a group of young men are taken down to Darwin, where they're arrested. And their trial makes headlines around the world, and in part because it's occurring at a moment when there is a real, I think, a global shift in sentiment towards Indigenous people. This case makes headlines and is really championed by organisations like the London Friends of the Aborigines and those sort of organisations. In part, I think people are beginning to become aware of the massacres that had occurred in other places, particularly the Coniston Massacre of 1928. And so in 1933, Thompson offers his services to the government to head up there on a peace-making mission, He treks overland from Roper River to meet with the legendary Yolngu leader Wongu Munungua at his camp at Gurkawoi in July of 1935. And so here you got these three kind of key players. You got Fred Gray, who manages to convince this group of young men to come down to Darwin for arrest, Thompson, who steps in, and Wongu, who was a giant of a man in every respect. So Thompson meets with Wongu, with his family, produces these extraordinary body of photographs, and he assures Wongu of the safe return of his sons, Nachiyama, Mao, and Narakaya, who were being held in the Fanny Bay jail in Darwin after being sentenced to life in prison. And Wongu, in his negotiations with Thompson, agrees to maintain the peace in the country. And he fashions these 2 message sticks for Thompson to take to Wongu's sons. Now, this is a gorgeous photo of these 2 message sticks, which you can go and see at the Art Centre at Yirrkala with Thompson's original labels. And apparently they turned up in somebody's cutlery drawer. So next time you're clearing your cutlery drawer, always make sure there's no little treasures in there. Wongu incised these as a symbol to indicate to his sons that it came from him and to give them assurance that it would be safe to go with Donald Thompson. And these message sticks are really this kind of symbol of this moment of exchange. And in his report to the Commonwealth Government, Thompson argues for the rights of these Indigenous people to their country. Even though those recommendations were not implemented at the time, they set up an interesting scenario where Wongu, in his mind, never relished his title to the lands. And in his mind, these paintings become the testaments to his title to these places. And so here we have the very first painting that Wongu painted for Thompson in 1935, and the image of him painting it. But over the next few trips, we would see some of the most truly extraordinary paintings emerge. And so here we have a painting that really is very, very different to any of the paintings that came before from Yirrkala, because what's been laid out is these clan designs that would be painted on the body during ceremony. And you can see that a painting like this is a fairly direct translation. It even has the bands at the top that would run over the shoulder of the boy that they were painted on. But at the same time, there's this incredible inventiveness appearing in these works that are produced by Wongu and his family. You look at a painting like this, and we see some of those designs, but we also see the insertion of narrative elements that would appear and reappear in Yolngu art over the next 8 decades. I particularly like this example here, where the feet in the top section are the, here I can use my pointer, but these feet that we see up here are the kinds of images that, it becomes a motif that is commonly used again and again over the next century. So these relationships that have been mapping out, I think, are a real key part to this story. At Milingimbi, the arrival of Edgar Wells in 1949 began in train a very important series of relationships with elders like Jawa, who at the time was the undisputed leader of the Yolngu community at Milingimbi. And for men like Jawa, painting was an opportunity to express himself to Edgar Wells whilst building his power in a relationship that brought him power in both the Yolngu community as well as in the white world. Now, Wells, after leaving Milingimbi, would travel to Yirrkala, and he would arrive there in the same year that the federal government approved the excising of 310 square kilometres of lands for the largest bauxite mine in the world. At the suggestion of the artist Narrachin Maimaru, Wells commissioned 2 paintings for the church, the newly built church at Yirrkala, that would be really 2 of the most important paintings ever painted in Australia. And to put these in context, they're on these 10 foot pieces of masonite that just tower above the viewer, and they're just utterly extraordinary. In July of that year, two members of the opposition, the government opposition, visit Yirrkala, and they see these paintings, and they meet with the elders, and they listen to the grievances of the elders against the mine that has been approved, and suggest that they should send a petition to Parliament. But being so bowled over by these church panels, Kim Beazley suggests that they should incorporate some of the people's own culture. The result is the Yirrkala Bark petitions, which are submitted to Parliament in August of 1963. And there's actually 4 of them here, they're all identical, which would lead to the case Milperim versus Nabalco, which was the first litigation of native title in Australia. This case was ultimately denied, and the judge ruled against the claimants on a number of issues of law and fact, but in his judgment he concluded by saying, "I cannot help but be specially conscious that for the plaintiffs this is a matter which their personal feelings are involved." In a note to both the government and the opposition, he said that a system of Aboriginal land rights was not only morally right, it was both morally right and socially expedient. This case would lead to the establishment of the Woodward Royal Commission and the recognition of Aboriginal land rights in the Northern Territory. And I think that this is so important because what it shows is that this system of negotiation is not just a system of explanation, but it's about recognition, and it's about taking control, and it runs hand in hand with political recognition of land rights, political recognition of personhood. And this is a great example. In 1963, the Reserve Bank of Australia managed to accidentally appropriate one of David Malangy's images on the new $1 note. And when this story broke in the Adelaide Advertiser, it caused a bit of a scandal, seeming to be a straightforward breach of copyright. But of course, things were not so straightforward, because in 1963, like most of the Northern Territory's Indigenous population, David Malangy was a ward of the state. So in the end, he was, with extreme caution, the Reserve Bank wrote that it would acknowledge his contribution and paid him $1,000 along with a fishing kit which he had requested. So we begin to see this moment where the copyright of David Malangy is recognised at a point prior to many other rights which would be properly afforded. But we see this insertion of art into these discourses. We see of recognition and of sovereignty. Within a decade and a half, Malangy, along with three of his fellow artists, George Malbeard and John Bungawai and George Milperim, were the first Indigenous Australian artists to exhibit at a contemporary art biennale when they were invited by Nick Waterlow to exhibit at the Sydney Biennale. Waterlow was the director again in 1988 when the artists of Arnhem were approached to participate in the Sydney Biennale of 1988, which was a fraught year, being the 200th anniversary of the British invasion, but where many Indigenous artists and communities were boycotting events, the artists of Arnhem chose to produce the installation, the Aboriginal Memorial, featuring 200 hollow log coffins, one for each year of the British occupation. And this work was so important because it resonated not just as a political challenge, but also as a work of contemporary installation art. It represented a moment when when Indigenous Australian art really broke into the contemporary art world. But I think that the key point I want to make here is that, as with all of the works that preceded it, these are works about looking forward as well as looking backwards, about never losing its identity or its sense of belonging to the land. I think that we can see that whether it's in the continuing development of bark painting, in the use of fibre arts, very traditional forms for modern ways of creating, or in new media, film and printmaking. And so I thought that, you know, the best way to round out that story might be, rather than me saying anything, to pass over the final words to Jumbo Marawili, who expresses these sentiments in a way that is much more profound, I think, than I could. So I'm just going to bring him up.
It is like a university, Bush University. I can say clear. If you know way of looking at the country, and your way of looking at the sea. And I think people who want to know about the sea and the land, we need to know about the story too. 3 or 4 clan groups are connected under the country. They call themselves a surname called Wannabe, and the Wannabe comes from the bar. My clan group named Mararpa. We are the Mararpa people. Mararpa means sparrow. Those colors are not coming from the shop. Those colors are all coming from the land. The patterns and designs all connected back to a human being. The animals and the human being all connected to the land. My name is Jumbo Marawili. This is my homeland. It's in my soul, in my blood, and I cannot be changed into a white fellow well or into European well. I am still black fellow. I know stories. I know the patterns and who I am. I am a mother.
Well, thank you, Henry. I think we could all give Henry a virtual round of applause and appreciate him for a great lecture. Be sure to follow Kluge-Ruhe on social media. We're really active these days on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll have more content coming to you. So look forward to seeing you again.